The issue of the NGO influence is something that's actually been a theme of our work at MCC Brussels. I remember one of the very first videos that we ever produced was around Qatargate, and what we identified then was not just the straightforward political corruption that everybody knows about, but also the role that so many NGOs seem to be playing in facilitating this corruption. And we've continued to follow these stories about NGO influence right through our work in our podcast and our Twitter roundup, which I hope you will follow. And I remember one of the ones that was most emblematic for me was before the Tusk government in Poland came to power. There was a meeting being held by a group of German NGOs that were talking about how to engineer full-blown regime change, how they're going to really support Tusk's program of militant democracy. And they've obviously succeeded in that. Now, the work that we have been discussing a bit was kind of kickstarted by a report that we released by the investigative journalist Thomas Farsi, which specifically looked at the role of pro-EU federalist, pro-integration NGOs in pushing what was essentially EU propaganda. And many of that was, the scale of the influence involved and the money was both shocking, but if you know anything about how the EU works, it was also somewhat unsurprising. Some highlights from that, the report, which you can scan the QR code and get to. I mean, some of my favorite examples were the almost €250 million over 10 years to Euronews, various scandals involving the secretive media buying programs of the European Union to support its policies, and in many cases, direct financing of NGOs would just seem to purely exist to sell the EU narrative. My personal favorite was the millions funded to a think tank headed by Guy Verhofstadt, one of the more unhinged pro-EU zealots. So I do urge you to read the report. There's many examples of projects supporting so-called democracy resilience or looking at how to produce disinformation countermeasures, which of course are just nothing but the attempt to propagandize citizens in Europe, and especially those citizens of so-called backward member states, to vote for commission-approved candidates and parties. In that report, we also take a look at some specific projects. One of them, there was one called Blue for EU that was involved right across many EU countries that was directly aimed at propagandizing young people. There was another project called EUturn 2025 in Germany, which has a budget of hundreds of thousands of euros, that was aimed at doing something called denationalizing European engagement. And whilst you're never quite sure what any of these terms mean, you know it's definitely not to do with democracy. NGOs, if you spend any time at Brussels and unfortunately bumped into somebody working for a pro-EU NGO, the chances are that they were directly receiving lots of money from the EU. The Union of European Federalists was receiving millions of euros. Their youth arm was receiving millions of more euros. The European Policy Centre receiving nearly 5.5 million. And also, one of the things that we discovered time and time again was that even when it seemed that the numbers were not enormous about what they were involved in, they were also had a key role in projects that were much, much bigger. So in some cases, you'd have a think tank that might receive tens of millions of euros, but it was actually involved in an enormous scale of projects of hundreds of millions of euros. And then, of course, the way in which the EU was channeling significant funds specifically into the so-called problem countries like Hungary or Poland, tens of millions of euros, even at a first glance, we were able to find in those countries. And then, I mean, this is such an important issue that we haven't, of course, stopped there. Our next report, which in its final form will be available very, very soon, looks at specifically the role of gender and transgender NGOs in pushing gender identity ideology. And here, if anything, some of the sums are even more insane and shocking. Of course, everybody's favorite gender NGO, ILGA, was receiving millions and millions of euros. Iglio, the kind of youth arm, was receiving more. An NGO called Transgender Europe was receiving as much as 4 million euros over 10 years. And so the gender report, which will be out, as I say, in its final form very soon, really exposes the way in which it seems the more extreme a position you took on gender identity, the more likely you were to receive more and more EU money. And then something that we began to uncover when doing this report was specifically the weaponization of research funding, specifically Horizon and projects like Horizon. And here, I mean, we could only laugh in the office as we discovered some of these projects. Our favorite one was maybe one called Men for Dem, which was a €3 million study literally saying that traditional masculinity was the major threat to European democracy. There was one that was obsessed about, it was called EUturn Ukraine towards carbon neutrality, that thought that the best thing that war-torn Ukraine needed was to become carbon neutral. That was almost 5 million euros of EU money. One, a diverse air city. They like these terrible puns. There was the power of diversity and social inclusion as a means for reducing air pollution, was an interesting one. That was millions of euros. There are plenty more. You wouldn't literally better stop discovering these. But the thing that was especially shocking, not just, I mean, naively you might have thought that the Horizon program was about funding basic scientific research, R&D, things that Europe solely needs. Instead, it's been almost wholly transformed into a way not just of paying otherwise unemployable academics, but also funneling money to NGOs and actually turning academics into NGOs and activists themselves. And then the final point I really want to talk about was the theme of transparency, because the more we got into this work, the more we realized that, as has already been mentioned, these systems and portals and databases and so-called transparency systems really are a joke. They're deliberately, it seems, designed to obscure what's going on. And every time we think we've got to the bottom of it, we realize there's another layer, another nuance, another way in which the data is either incomplete or misleading. And each time we've gone back, revised our figures, looked again, I'd like to think we have a genuine commitment to transparency rather than these ones. So our work is definitely, this is an evolving piece of work, and as we discover more, we only realize how big the kind of black hole is the more and more we discover. So that's why we have been joining this call for the creation of a EU Doge, some kind of relatively militant organization that's prepared to get seriously to the bottom of this, and definitely very important to take up this work, and we'll love to continue doing that and providing the expertise we have. And I should call out my excellent colleagues, especially Jamie, who's in the room with us, who's done a tremendous work in uncovering how this all really works. But there's a lot more to do in terms of freedom of information requests, parliamentary questions, all the like. And I know that if we pool a little bit of resources, we'll be able to make a huge impact here. So I hope that this gives you a bit of a flavor of both the scale of the propaganda complex that we're fighting and also the enormous effort that we have to undertake to bring it to light. So thank you.